will be Charles Post, who is Professor of Sociology at Borough at Manhattan College in City University of New York, CUNY. He, of course, as we all know, writes on the origins of capitalism and social class, and his book has been read widely by my students and others over the last few years. The American Road to Capitalism, Studies in Class Structure, Economic Development, and Political Conflict.
I was given the rather difficult task by Greg and Leo and Vivek to talk about hopeful signs of hope in the U.S. labor movement. For those of you who pay any attention to what's going on just south of the border, you're aware that the labor movement in the United States, the sort of most advanced and aggressive capitalist economy in the universe, is probably all the advanced capitalist countries, is probably the weakest and most disorganized. We have seen over 30 years of almost continuous defeats and decline of the official labor movement. In some ways today, the US labor movement is facing its worst institutional crisis since the late 1920s. There are sections of the ruling class in the US who would like to, in fact, thoroughly de-unionize the United States. The Democrats would like to keep the unions around as long as they're willing to give back concessions, etc., so they can have somebody to contribute to their election campaigns and somebody to ring on doorbells. But that generally, I think for most of us, we know that the situation in the US for the labor movement and for the working class more broadly is pretty dire. However, what I want to talk about is there have been, since the onset of the crisis in 2008, several major and important struggles. And I want to focus on 5 of them. All of these struggles have been extremely sectoral and localized. All of them have been essentially defensive, to defend what workers had gained or held on to over the last 30 to 40 years. Most of them, as I'll point out, ended in defeat. A couple of them in victory, and I want to sort of draw out what were the things that made them successful. The first of these struggles that broke out almost immediately after the onset of the crisis was in December of 2008, when a relatively small factory in Chicago, Republic Windows and Doors, its management announced almost overnight that they were going to shut their doors and lay off their workforce of a couple of hundred, mostly Latino workers. And they were going to shut it down, giving people no severance pay, etc. And the workers there, who were organized as the United Electrical Workers, a very small union that exists outside of the 2 major union federations, organized a sit-down strike, a sit-in. They seized the factory, challenged the owner's ability to actually effectively shut it down, sell off the machinery, sell off the stock, etc. The strike galvanized the labor left in the US, galvanized sections of the official labor movement. And for many people on the left in the US, they hoped that this was going to spark a broader struggle. It did not, although these workers did in fact successfully stop the shutdown, win severance pay, and eventually were able to get somebody else to buy the factory and keep it open for a period of time. The second struggle, important defensive struggle that broke out, was the what's become known as the Wisconsin Uprising. The far-right Republican governor of the state of Wisconsin in early 2009 first proposed major cuts in social services, which were going to massively impact the poorest sections of the working class, which are overwhelmingly people of color in the US, and particularly in the state of Wisconsin. And they announced that they were going to essentially pull recognition from the public sector unions. And in the US, the public sector is the last bastion of organized labor in my country. The labor leadership, the official labor leadership in Wisconsin said, hey, we're willing to sacrifice all those black and brown people who collect welfare, and we're even willing to sacrifice the wages, benefits, and working conditions of our own members, but don't pull union recognition. They planned a day of lobbying in Madison, which is the state capital in Wisconsin, which, because of the actions of a fairly democratic, bottom-up run union of teaching assistants, quickly turned into, who did an unauthorized sit-in at the state capitol, turned into a massive occupation of the state capitol, which combined with massive mobilizations reaching up to 100,000 people in a state whose population is less than 20 million in Wisconsin? Far less. Huge demonstrations that went on for almost 5 or 6 weeks, at the end of which, between agreements between the union leaders, Democratic politicians who returned to town, etc., the occupation of the Capitol ended and recognition was withdrawn. The struggle, as inspiring as it was for many of us, failed. The third wave of struggles came around Occupy. Occupy helped galvanize many people in the labor movement to begin to, hoping that they could link up with this movement of young people to challenge the offensive by their employers. This went the furthest on the West Coast, where in Oakland, young people with the support of a handful of mostly retired militants from Local 10 of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union essentially shut down the port of Oakland for about 24 hours. The massive longshoremen were not actively supporting the strike, but had enough strike experience and political experience that they were not going to cross picket lines. Even more importantly was the developing alliance between Occupy and Local 21 of the ILWU. Local 21 is in Longview, Washington, and there they faced EGT, a major grain shipper who were operating a dock in Longview, who essentially wanted to bust the ILWU and operate non-union. For weeks, Occupy and the members, the couple hundred members of this local, engaged in civil disobedience, confronted the police, etc. And it looked at one point that Occupy activists from all over the West Coast in the fall of 2011 were going to descend on Longview and actually block the attempt by the U.S. Coast Guard to bring in scab ships. This very promising development was broken by the International Longshore and Warehousemen Union's leadership, who actually sent officials and staffers from locals all up and down the West Coast to physically disrupt a meeting of Local 21 activists and Occupy activists. In the end, Local 21 wasn't broken. EGT agreed to a collective bargaining agreement, but one which included major concessions on hiring, work rules, etc., and which is going to serve as a wedge for the sort of concessions that the Pacific Maritime Association, which represents the larger stevedore companies up and down the West Coast, will use in the upcoming master agreements coming down the road. The fourth struggle was the struggle of the Chicago Teachers Union. Last fall, the Chicago Teachers Union successfully stood up to what is the cutting edge of the neoliberal offensive under the Democratic Party, which is the attack on public education and the attack on teacher unions. They organized their own membership, and they made a concerted and successful attempt to reach out to mostly Black and Latino parents in Chicago, and launched a week-long strike that had amazing support, not only among their own members, but among the general population, particularly parents in Chicago. They challenged a city administration led by Rahm Emanuel, Obama's former chief of staff, and they basically they were successfully, to a limited extent, challenged the Obama administration's neoliberal agenda for education in what was ground zero. This is where Arne Duncan, who's now the U.S. Secretary of Education, first started to experiment back in the mid-2000s with these neoliberal reforms. The fifth struggle has been the ongoing struggle of warehouse and store workers at Walmart. We have seen three different groups. The largest and most important has been the United Food and Commercial Workers through our Walmart organization, attempting to organize public demonstrations, etc., and some job actions at Walmart stores and at the distribution centers, which are central to the supply chain, supplying Walmart with the products that Arun talked about they get from Asia, etc. The second group has been the United Electrical Workers, who in Chicago have been focusing on building worker committees in warehouses in Chicago that supply Walmart. And finally, there's a smaller group called New Labor, which has set up workers' councils, consejos, mostly among Black and Latino immigrant workers in New Jersey. While very, very impressive, none of these struggles have yet won substantial improvements, either wages, hours, regularization of employment, or of working conditions. Now, what accounts for the failures, what accounts for the successes? And how much time do I have there? About 4 minutes. I'm going to have to be very, very brief. Those struggles that were led by the official bureaucratic leadership of the U.S. Union movement, and where there was no independent organization of what we used to on the left call the militant minority. Those workers who were willing, able to take action, effective action in the workplace, independently of their official union leaders. In those struggles, where the union leaders were dominant and where there was no effective organization of this militant minority, those struggles lost. That was clearly the case in Wisconsin, where a very promising wildcat, or sick out by public school teachers, which could have actually sparked broader strike action, was squashed by the leadership of the Madison Teachers Union. It was certainly the case, in the ILWU struggles and their relationship to Occupy, where a left-wing leadership of a major union had successfully undermined continuously any independent attempts to organize this militant minority. And it's very much the case, I would argue, with the UFCW-led attempts to organize at Walmart, where it was very top-down and where basically the UFCW in late January agreed under the pressure from the National Labor Relations Board to stop the public picketing. Where were they successful? Where they were successful was where that militant minority was able to successfully organize and successfully pose an alternative to bureaucratic business unionism, and where they were beginning to be willing to challenge capitalist legality in general, defense of private property, and more importantly, challenge the National Labor Relations Board legal framework for union recognition and collective bargaining in the U.S. This was certainly the case at Republic Windows and Doors. The UE, United Electrical Workers, is very small, basically has a handful of contracts, but has engaged and maintained itself over the last 15 or 20 years by organizing what in the U.S. is called non-majority unions. Unions which organize strong workplace committees, but do not attempt to go through the National Labor Relations Board process of elections, etc., which then tie them into a legal framework which makes it impossible for them to effectively organize. UE had effectively helped the workers at Republic Windows and Doors throw out a useless and corrupt company union almost a decade earlier, and had built strong and effective workplace organization so that when that shutdown came, they were able to they had the organization and the militants in place to take effective action. It's clearly the case also in Chicago. About 5 years ago, a group of activists, mostly radicals, some members of socialist groups, etc., began to organize what became the Coalition of Rank and File Educators. These folks not only developed a very profound critique of neoliberalism in education, but drew important lessons from previous failed attempts to reform the Chicago Teachers Union, which focused solely on winning union election and taking office. A previous reform effort had led to a complete failure about 10 years earlier. These folks were able to organize in their schools even before they won, and when they took office, their first task was to rebuild the union in the schools. Public education unions, particularly the K through 12 level in the US, are, for the most part, empty shells of what they were even 20 years ago. I taught public high school about 25 years ago, and the United Federation of Teachers, which is the largest teachers union in the United States, bureaucratic business unionists, but they had active chapters, they had people who would file grievances, etc. Today, in almost a third of the schools in New York, and this was certainly the case in Chicago, the unions simply did not exist. Or if they existed as an extension of management. CTU is able to rebuild effective union committees in every single school, and they were able to then use these committees in the run-up to the strike to actually reach out to parent organizations, so that when they issued their very radical and really visionary statement on what public education should be, they were able to actually organize and bring some social power to realize some of their demands. So to sum up, I think the lesson for me, the lesson of these struggles since the beginning of the crisis is that for the revitalization of the labor movement in the US and the revitalization of working class politics in the US, which I think rests on reviving working class organization at the workplace and more broadly, this reorganization of this very weak and disorganized militant minority is at the center. And that part and parcel of reorganizing this militant minority is a combination of a laser focus on rebuilding our power at the workplace, combined with a broad social and political vision that challenges neoliberalism broadly, including the way neoliberalism has reorganized the reproduction of labor power, that is all intimately linked to a willingness to confront capitalist legality generally, and most importantly, to challenge the National Labor Relations Board's regime of labor relations, which I'll go into more in the discussion if people want to hear. Thank you.